The studio lights burned bright, illuminating the sleek, modern set of one of the most watched liberal talk shows in America. The anticipation in the room was palpable, an audience divided between progressive activists. Veterans and conservative patriots sat in restless silence, waiting for the night's debate to begin. Seated on one side of the stage, looking calm, confident, and composed, was Barron Trump. At just 21 years old, the son of former President Donald Trump had become a rising voice for young conservatives, defying expectations with his sharp intellect and measured demeanor. Facing him on the other side sat John Reynolds, a former Marine veteran known for his outspoken liberal views. Once a fierce defender of American values, John had grown disillusioned after his service, believing that Trumpism had betrayed the very country he once fought for. The moderator, a seasoned TV journalist with a reputation for leaning left, adjusted his microphone and offered a polite yet knowing smile. Tonight, we bring you an unprecedented discussion, two generations, two perspectives, one heated debate. On one side, we have Barron Trump, representing a new wave of conservative voices. And on the other, John Reynolds, a decorated Marine who believes that America has lost its way under Trump-era policies. The audience clapped enthusiastically, though it was clear that support was divided. Some wore military hats, standing proudly for their fellow veteran, while others sported anti-Trump pins and shirts, signaling their disdain for anything related to the former president. The energy was electric, but Barron remained unshaken. He adjusted his suit, leaned slightly forward, and locked eyes with the moderator. "Let's start with the obvious question," the moderator began, his voice smooth, but edged with subtle provocation. "John, as a veteran, do you feel that the America you fought for has honored your service?" John Reynolds exhaled sharply, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. His jaw tightened as he turned toward Barron, eyes burning with frustration. "No," he said firmly, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't." The audience shifted uncomfortably, some murmuring in agreement, others shaking their heads. John leaned forward, his gaze intense. "And I'll tell you why. The Trump administration, the MAGA movement, your father, they used us. They waved the flag, said support our troops. But when we came home, we were forgotten. Homelessness, PTSD, lack of health care. Where was the America First policy then?" A wave of applause erupted from one side of the audience. Barron sat still, his expression unreadable, but his fingers tapped lightly against the armrest of his chair, a subtle signal that he was calculating his response. The first shot had been fired. Would Barron hold his ground? Would he let the accusations stand? Or would he fire back with facts that no one saw coming? A heavy silence settled over the studio. The words of John Reynolds still hung in the air, his accusation cutting deep into the heart of the debate. The audience waited, some nodding in agreement, others shifting in discomfort. Barron Trump remained composed, his posture relaxed but his mind sharp. He had expected this argument, had prepared for it. He leaned slightly forward, his voice measured but firm. "Mr. Reynolds, I respect your service. No one can deny the sacrifices you and your fellow veterans have made for this country. But let's address the facts." He paused, letting the room settle before continuing. "Under my father's administration, veteran homelessness dropped by nearly 50%. The VA received historic funding, and new programs were put in place to fast-track medical care for those who served. Are you saying that none of that mattered?" A murmur ran through the audience. Some nodded in agreement, others whispered among themselves. John's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected Barron to come back with numbers so quickly. "You think statistics tell the whole story?" he shot back. "Go outside and talk to the men sleeping under bridges. Go to the VA hospitals where veterans are still waiting months for basic care. I don't care what your charts say, the reality on the ground is different." The moderator cleared his throat, sensing the rising tension. "Mr. Reynolds, would you say that the issue isn't just policy, but broken promises?" John nodded. Exactly. Every politician, Republican or Democrat, talks about supporting the troops. But when we come home, we're just another statistic. Barron studied him for a moment before responding. If you don't trust statistics, then let's talk about reality. He turned slightly, addressing both the audience and his opponent. The reality is that the media only tells one side of the story. They amplify every failure and ignore every success. When my father signed the V Accountability Act, corrupt officials were finally held responsible for mistreating veterans. When he pushed for school choice, military families had better education options for their children. Yet, all people hear is Trump betrayed veterans. Why? Because that fits a political narrative. A ripple of applause came from the right side of the audience. John clenched his fists. You think this is about media bias? I lived this. I saw my fellow Marines come home and struggle. I watched families break apart because of PTSD and untreated injuries. Your father might have signed a few bills, but that doesn't mean the problem is solved. Barron nodded, acknowledging the emotion behind the words. I don't deny that there's still work to be done. But blaming one man, one administration, while ignoring decades of failed policies before him, isn't an honest argument. The tension in the room thickened. The moderator glanced between them, sensing that the debate was heating up. He leaned slightly forward. Mr. Reynolds, let's shift the discussion. Many veterans feel abandoned, but others believe that government programs are not the solution at all. Some argue that private initiatives and nonprofits do a better job than federal programs. What's your take on that? John took a deep breath, his expression unreadable. Government has a duty to its veterans. Relying on charity and nonprofits is a cop-out. Barron tilted his head slightly, a small knowing smile forming at the corner of his lips. So you trust the same government that has failed veterans for decades? A sudden hush fell over the room. The audience shifted, waiting to see how John would respond. The debate had just taken a deeper turn. John Reynolds took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the armrest of his chair. He had faced pressure before on the battlefield, in front of commanding officers, but this was different. Barron Trump wasn't attacking him personally. He wasn't yelling, wasn't emotional. Instead, he was using logic, turning the conversation into something much harder to fight against. John leaned forward, his voice rough but steady. I trust the government because it made a promise. A country that sends its men and women to war has a duty to care for them when they return. That's not charity. That's not politics. That's basic decency. Barron nodded, his expression thoughtful. And yet, for decades, both Democrat and Republican administrations have failed to keep that promise. You say it's about duty, but what happens when the government fails in that duty? What happens when bureaucrats in Washington decide your life is just another number in a report? John scoffed. And you think the solution is leaving veterans at the mercy of private charities? You want billionaires to decide who gets treatment and who doesn't. Barron's eyes didn't waver. I think the solution is accountability. The government has proven, time and time again, that it is inefficient at handling veterans' affairs. So why not allow more private hospitals, more independent organizations, more direct funding to those who actually get results? A murmur spread through the audience. The moderator, sensing an opportunity to escalate the debate, leaned in. John, let me ask you this. Do you feel that veterans have been replaced? That while men like you fight for this country, others who haven't contributed are given more benefits? John exhaled slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. I see illegal immigrants getting housing before veterans. I see college kids demanding free tuition while veterans struggle to afford basic medical care. I see politicians talking about equality while the people who risked everything are pushed aside. For the first time, the audience seemed unified in their reaction, a mix of nods and murmurs of agreement from both sides. Barron folded his hands together. So you admit that government mismanagement is the real problem? John hesitated, but then shook his head. It's not just mismanagement, it's priorities. Politicians use veterans when it's convenient. They wave the flag when they need votes, and then they move on. Barron's voice remained calm, but the intensity in his eyes sharpened. And yet, the loudest voices in this country aren't fighting for veterans. They're fighting for people who broke the law to come here. They're fighting for criminals who deserve a second chance. They're fighting for students who claim they're oppressed while getting degrees in gender studies. Where are the protests for the men and women who actually sacrificed for this country? The studio fell into a deep silence. John's lips parted slightly as if to respond, but no words came out. The question hung in the air, waiting. The moderator shifted in his seat, breaking the silence. Let's move to another key issue: gun rights. Mr. Reynolds, as a veteran, do you believe that Americans should have the same right to carry weapons as soldiers do? John blinked, as if adjusting to the new battlefield. The debate was far from over. John Reynolds adjusted in his seat, his posture slightly tenser than before. He had been caught off guard by Barron's last statement, but now the topic had shifted, and he was back on familiar ground. He exhaled slowly before speaking. I carried weapons in war zones. I trained for years to handle them responsibly. Civilians don't have that training. They don't understand what it means to take a life. And yet, you want every random person on the street to have access to the same weapons we used in combat? A wave of applause erupted from the left side of the audience. Barron waited for the noise to settle, then responded, his voice calm but deliberate. The right to bear arms isn't about war. It's about self-defense. It's about ensuring that law-abiding Americans aren't at the mercy of criminals, or worse, a tyrannical government. John shook his head. That's the fantasy they sell you. But let's talk reality. How many mass shootings do we need before we admit that easy access to guns is the problem? More applause from the left side of the crowd. Barron leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked on John. Let's talk reality then. Do you know what all these mass shootings have in common? They happen in gun-free zones. Schools, malls, theaters, places where law-abiding citizens aren't allowed to carry. The criminals don't follow the rules. And you want to disarm the people who do? The right side of the audience broke into applause. John scoffed. And what do you suggest? More guns? More shootouts in the streets? You think putting weapons in more hands makes us safer? Barron didn't blink. I think taking them away makes us more vulnerable. You, of all people, should understand that. You've been in war zones. When bad guys show up with guns, what stops them? John opened his mouth, then shut it. Barron continued. It's not gun control, it's good guys with guns. The moderator, who had been sitting back, now leaned in again, seizing the moment to push the discussion further. Mr. Reynolds, do you believe that only the government and law enforcement should have firearms? John hesitated, but then nodded. Yes, I believe trained professionals should be the only ones carrying weapons. Barron let the answer hang in the air for a moment before speaking. You trust the government that, as you just admitted, has failed veterans? The same politicians who you say use soldiers like pawns? Now you want them to be the only ones with guns? A murmur ran through the audience. John inhaled sharply, his frustration evident. That's not what I'm saying. Barron tilted his head slightly. Isn't it? The audience remained still, absorbing the moment. The moderator cleared his throat. Let's move to another key issue. Many veterans struggle when they return home. PTSD, unemployment, mental health, what should be done? And Mr. Trump, do you believe America is doing enough? John exhaled, as if relieved to be back on safer ground. The battle was far from over. John Reynolds ran a hand through his graying hair, his eyes momentarily drifting toward the audience. This was the topic he had been waiting for, the one that hit closest to home. Let me tell you what happens when soldiers come home, he began, his voice rough but steady. We go from being warfighters to paperwork. We wait in endless lines at the VA. We fight bureaucracy instead of enemies. And when we break, when we can't handle it anymore, society turns its back on us. The audience was silent. Even those who had been cheering against him earlier seemed to feel the weight of his words. Barron Trump didn't interrupt. He let John speak. 22 veterans take their own lives every single day. Do you know what that means? That means by the time this debate is over, another veteran will be gone. And yet, every year, Washington throws billions at foreign aid, at illegal immigrants, at useless projects that mean nothing to the average American. Where is that money when a veteran needs a doctor? When his family is struggling? When he's on the edge of ending it all? Scattered applause mixed with murmurs of agreement. Even some of Barron's supporters nodded at the painful reality. Barron folded his hands together, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke. "You're right," he said simply. John looked up, slightly surprised. "You're absolutely right," Barron continued. "Veterans have been ignored. They have been let down. And that's not just on Democrats or Republicans. It's on every single politician who put themselves before the people who fought for this country." John's lips parted slightly as if to respond, but Barron wasn't finished. "But here's what I don't understand. You know the system is broken. You've lived it. You've suffered under it. And yet, when people like my father tried to change it, the same politicians who claimed to care about veterans fought against every single reform. They called it controversial. They blocked funding. They told you everything was fine while it rotted from the inside. And now you stand here defending that system?" John exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not that simple." Barron leaned forward slightly. "Isn't it?" The moderator interjected, eager to stir the discussion. "John, you mentioned that Washington prioritizes foreign aid over American veterans. Do you believe the U.S. should cut its financial commitments to countries like Ukraine and instead focus solely on its own people?" John hesitated. "Look, I don't think we should abandon our allies, but—" Barron cut in smoothly. "But America's heroes should come first." A murmur spread through the audience. John shook his head, his frustration evident. "The world isn't that black and white." Barron didn't flinch. "Maybe not. But tell that to the veterans sleeping under a bridge while politicians send another billion overseas." John opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time since the debate began, he didn't have an immediate answer. John Reynolds shifted in his seat, his fingers pressing together as if searching for the right words. The weight of Barron's last statement hung in the air, heavier than anything else said so far. "I don't disagree that America's heroes should come first," he finally admitted. "But cutting off aid to our allies isn't the answer. You think if we stop funding Ukraine, that money will magically be redirected to veterans? It won't. It'll go to corporate bailouts, to more government waste. That's how Washington works." Barron nodded, his face unreadable. "Then why defend a system that's broken?" John exhaled. "Because the alternative is worse." Barron tilted his head slightly. "Worse than what? Worse than veterans being homeless? Worse than politicians funding wars they'll never fight in? Worse than billions leaving this country while American families can't afford groceries?" A ripple of agreement moved through the audience. Even some who had been cheering for John earlier seemed to pause. John clenched his jaw. "You don't understand what it means to serve." Barron didn't react, waiting for him to continue. "I went overseas and saw what happens when America abandons its allies. I saw what happens when dictators take over, when power vacuums are left unchecked. You think isolationism is the answer? That just because someone isn't born here, their freedom doesn't matter?" Barron remained calm. "No, but I think that if a government can't take care of its own people, it has no business pretending it can take care of anyone else." The audience reacted with scattered applause, while John leaned back slightly, shaking his head. The moderator seized the moment. "John, would you say the U.S. government has lost sight of its priorities?" John hesitated, then sighed. "Yes, but the problem isn't just about money, it's about values. It's about how we define patriotism. Barron raised an eyebrow. You think patriotism means funding foreign wars while our own soldiers sleep on the streets? John's jaw tightened. I think patriotism means standing up for what's right, even when it's not easy. Barron's expression didn't change. Then why do the same politicians who talk about what's right always seem to put Americans last? John didn't answer right away. He exhaled slowly, his gaze flickering toward the moderator as if expecting him to intervene. But the moderator stayed silent, waiting. Barron leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. The truth is, the people running this country care more about their image than their citizens. They care more about looking good on the world stage than fixing the problems here at home. And people like you, people who have served, who have sacrificed, you're the ones they use to justify it all. John's eyes darkened. I'm nobody's pawn. Barron met his gaze, unshaken. Then stop defending the ones who treat you like one. The room was silent. The audience waited for John to respond. The debate was only getting started. John Reynolds leaned back, exhaling through his nose. His fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair, his thoughts racing. Barron Trump wasn't like his father. He didn't yell, didn't use insults. He was precise, methodical, and worse, he wasn't easy to shake. John turned back to him, his voice lower but no less firm. You want to talk about politicians using people like me? Fine, but don't act like your father's hands are clean. He waved the flag, called us great patriots, and then left us with the same broken system as everyone else before him. Barron nodded slightly, acknowledging the argument. And yet, under his administration, veteran homelessness dropped. VA reform was finally put into action. Foreign wars were ended instead of started. So if my father didn't do enough, why didn't the next administration build on what was working? Why did they reverse course? John clenched his jaw. Because politics is bigger than one man. One president doesn't fix a system this broken. Barron's eyes narrowed slightly. Then why do you blame only my father? John hesitated. The audience was dead silent. Barron didn't let up. You served this country. You fought for it. And when you came home, you expected that sacrifice to mean something. But here you are, still fighting not against foreign enemies, but against the very government that sent you overseas. Doesn't that tell you something? John scoffed. What? That we should just stop trying? Barron shook his head. No, that maybe the problem isn't just the policies, but the people running them. That maybe instead of trusting the same politicians who keep failing, it's time to demand something different. John exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. The moderator took the opportunity to stir the conversation in another direction. John, you talk about sacrifice. Many on the left argue that patriotism today means more than just serving in the military. That social justice, climate change, and activism are just as important as defending the country. Do you agree? John hesitated. His hands tightened into fists for a brief moment before he looked back at Barron. You know what sacrifice is? John said, his voice raw. It's standing in the desert, waiting for an explosion that might never come. It's losing brothers in combat and carrying that weight for the rest of your life. It's knowing that, no matter how hard it gets, you can't give up because the moment you do, people die. He turned toward the audience, shaking his head. You want to compare that to holding a protest sign in front of a Starbucks? Half the audience erupted in applause. The other half murmured in disapproval. Barron didn't look away. Then why do the loudest voices in this country belong to the ones who have sacrificed the least? John sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Because that's the world we live in. Barron leaned forward. Then let's change it. The conversation was far from over. John let out a slow breath, shaking his head. You think it's that simple? That we can just change it by talking louder than the ones running this country? Barron didn't blink. Not just talking louder, by refusing to let them rewrite what sacrifice actually means. John ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, his frustration showing. "Look, kid." Barron raised an eyebrow at the word but said nothing. "You don't change a nation with debates and slogans. You don't take power from the people who already have it. The ones controlling the narrative aren't going to just step aside because we demand it. They'll double down. They'll bury anyone who stands against them." Barron tilted his head. "You sound like a man who's already lost." John's jaw tightened. "I sound like a man who's seen what happens when people underestimate their enemy." Barron leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And yet here we are. The loudest voices aren't the strongest ones. The ones in charge aren't the ones who built this country. And the people controlling the future aren't the ones who actually fought for it. You tell me, how does that end?" John hesitated. The moderator, sensing an opportunity to stir the fire, spoke up. "John, many argue that patriotism itself has changed. That standing for the flag, respecting tradition, and believing in America's greatness is outdated thinking. Do you believe America is still the country you once fought for?" John hesitated. He had spent years defending the very ground he stood on. He had bled for the flag, lost friends for it. And yet now he barely recognized the country he had come home to. His lips parted, the answer forming in his mind. But before he could speak, Barron did. "Or has America already surrendered and no one wants to admit it?" The studio was silent. John didn't look away this time. He had no choice but to answer. John Reynolds let out a slow breath. The weight of Barron's question pressed against him, and for the first time in the debate, he didn't have an immediate answer. The studio was dead silent. Even the moderator hesitated, waiting for John to respond. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice lower than before. "America hasn't surrendered. But it's not the same country I fought for." His words landed heavily, not just with Barron, but with the audience as well. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked unsettled, as if they didn't want to admit the truth they had just heard. Barron's expression remained unreadable. What changed? John exhaled. "People stopped believing in what made this country great. They don't respect the flag anymore. They don't respect the sacrifice. They think America is the problem, not the solution." He turned toward the audience, his gaze sharp. "We've got kids in schools being taught to hate the country they were born in. We've got people who think freedom is a privilege, not a right. And the worst part? They're winning." Barron nodded slightly, his voice steady. "And you're telling me the answer is to let them keep winning?" John shook his head. "I'm telling you the fight isn't fair. The people who run this country, the ones in power, they don't fight with truth. They fight with control. They control the schools, the media, the corporations. You think you can debate them into giving that up?" Barron's lips pressed together for a moment before he spoke. "No, but I think we can remind people why America is worth fighting for." John let out a bitter laugh. "And how do you plan on doing that?" Barron met his gaze, unwavering. "By proving that not all of us have surrendered." The tension in the room thickened. The audience wasn't just watching a debate anymore. They were witnessing a battle over something much bigger. Something neither side could afford to lose. John Reynolds rubbed his hands together, his gaze never leaving Barron. "Not all of us have surrendered? That sounds nice in a speech. But tell me, how do you actually fight back against a system that's already rigged?" Barron leaned forward, his posture relaxed but his tone unwavering. "By refusing to play by their rules." John raised an eyebrow. "And what does that mean, exactly? Ignoring the media? Ignoring the government? Just pretending none of this is happening?" Barron shook his head. "It means not letting them define us. It means not apologizing for believing that America is still the greatest country in the world. It means standing up when they tell us to sit down, speaking when they tell us to be silent. Because the second we start letting them control what we say, what we believe, that's the moment they win." The audience was divided, one side nodding in agreement, the other shifting uncomfortably. John exhaled sharply. That's easy for you to say. You grew up in wealth. You didn't have to fight for anything. Barron's expression darkened slightly. You think I don't have to fight? He gestured toward the cameras, the lights, the audience. Every word I say is dissected, twisted, used against me. People like you say I don't understand sacrifice, but I live under a different kind of battlefield. I don't get to just be a kid. I don't get to just have an opinion. Everything I say becomes a headline. And no matter what I do, there will always be people who want to see me fail, not because of who I am, but because of my last name. The room was silent. Even John seemed to pause. Barron continued, You say the system is rigged. I know it is. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. It means we fight smarter. John leaned back, his arms crossed. And what does that look like? Barron didn't hesitate. It looks like refusing to let them rewrite history. It looks like protecting the voices they want silenced. It looks like reminding people that patriotism isn't hate, that strength isn't oppression, that believing in your country doesn't make you a villain. John exhaled, shaking his head. That's not a strategy. That's just words. Barron didn't blink. Words shape nations. That's why they're trying to control them. The moderator, who had been silent for a while, finally spoke up. John, do you believe there's still a future for America as the country you once fought for? John hesitated, looking at Barron, looking at the audience. He had seen war. He had seen men die for this country. He had seen sacrifice in its rawest form. And yet, now sitting here, he wasn't sure if the fight was still the same. He exhaled slowly. I don't know. Barron's eyes locked onto his. Then maybe it's time to decide. John Reynolds sat motionless, Barron's words lingering between them. The audience, sensing the shift in tone, leaned forward in their seats. The debate had started as an exchange of arguments, but now it had become something deeper, an examination of what America had become. John finally spoke, his voice lower than before. You say it's time to decide, but decide what, exactly? That we just pretend everything is fine? That we act like this country isn't falling apart? Barron shook his head. No, that we stop letting the people who hate this country be the ones who define it. John exhaled sharply. And what happens when we do? When we refuse to bend the knee, refuse to accept their version of America? You think they'll just back down? They'll double down. They'll call us extremists. They'll call us threats. They'll do everything they can to destroy us. Barron leaned forward, his expression unreadable. So what's the alternative? Give up? Let them win? You, of all people, should know that once you surrender, the fight is over. John clenched his jaw, shaking his head. It's not about surrendering. It's about knowing when the battle is lost. Barron's eyes flashed with something unreadable. Then maybe the real problem is that too many people like you have already decided we've lost. The tension in the studio thickened. The moderator, sensing the weight of the conversation, chose his next words carefully. John, if you believe the fight is already lost, then what would you say to the veterans still fighting to hold on to the country they swore an oath to defend? John hesitated. He looked down, his fingers interlocked, deep in thought. For the first time, the man who had been speaking with certainty now looked uncertain. Barron didn't let the silence last. I think I know what you would tell them, he said, his voice steady, that the oath they swore still means something, that America is still worth fighting for. John exhaled, his shoulders sinking slightly. He didn't respond, because for the first time, he wasn't sure what to say. The silence in the studio was heavy. The weight of Barron's words settled over the room like a storm cloud, pressing down on John Reynolds as he stared at the floor. The audience wasn't murmuring anymore. No shifting, no half-hearted applause. They were waiting, watching. John let out a slow breath before finally lifting his gaze. I never said America isn't worth fighting for. Barron's expression didn't change. Then why does it sound like you've already given up? John clenched his jaw. Because I've seen what happens when people fight a war they can't win. Barron tilted his head slightly. You've also seen what happens when people refuse to fight at all. The two men locked eyes. John exhaled sharply. What are you asking me, kid? You want me to believe that if we just stand up and refuse to let them win, everything will go back to how it was? Barron shook his head. No, I want you to believe that if we don't, it'll never stop getting worse. The moderator, who had been mostly quiet, finally cut in. John, let me ask you this. If you could change one thing about this country right now, what would it be? John leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together as if deep in thought. His expression darkened. I'd make people remember what this country actually stands for. Barron folded his hands in front of him, his voice calm but pointed. And what happens when the people in power don't want them to remember? John scoffed, shaking his head. Then I guess we've got a hell of a fight ahead of us. Barron's lips curled into the smallest hint of a smile. Then maybe it's time we stop pretending there's another option. A heavy pause. John looked away for a moment, his thoughts clearly racing. Then he turned back, his expression unreadable. You know, for a kid who's never been to war, you sure talk like a soldier. Barron didn't flinch. Maybe that's because I know the battle's already here, and surrender isn't an option. John studied him for a long moment. For the first time since the debate began, he didn't argue. The silence in the studio was heavy. The weight of Barron's words settled over the room like a storm cloud, pressing down on John Reynolds as he stared at the floor. The audience wasn't murmuring anymore. No shifting, no half-hearted applause. They were waiting, watching. John let out a slow breath before finally lifting his gaze. I never said America isn't worth fighting for. Barron's expression didn't change. Then why does it sound like you've already given up? John clenched his jaw. Because I've seen what happens when people fight a war they can't win. Barron tilted his head slightly. You've also seen what happens when people refuse to fight at all. The two men locked eyes. John exhaled sharply. What are you asking me, kid? You want me to believe that if we just stand up and refuse to let them win, everything will go back to how it was? Barron shook his head. No, I want you to believe that if we don't, it'll never stop getting worse. The moderator, who had been mostly quiet, finally cut in. John, let me ask you this. If you could change one thing about this country right now, what would it be? John leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together as if deep in thought. His expression darkened. I'd make people remember what this country actually stands for. Barron folded his hands in front of him, his voice calm but pointed. And what happens when the people in power don't want them to remember? John scoffed, shaking his head. Then I guess we've got a hell of a fight ahead of us. Barron's lips curled into the smallest hint of a smile. Then maybe it's time we stop pretending there's another option. A heavy pause. John looked away for a moment, his thoughts clearly racing. Then he turned back, his expression unreadable. You know, for a kid who's never been to war, you sure talk like a soldier. Barron didn't flinch. Maybe that's because I know the battle's already here, and surrender isn't an option. John studied him for a long moment. For the first time since the debate began, he didn't argue. John Reynolds exhaled slowly, his hands tightening around the arms of his chair. You keep talking about a battle, but what exactly do you think we're fighting? Barron Trump didn't hesitate. A war without guns. A war for the minds of the next generation. A war over truth, over values, over the future of this country. John scoffed. You think that's new? That war has been going on for decades, and guess what? We've been losing. Barron leaned forward slightly. Because too many people like you have been convinced that it's already over. John's jaw clenched. And you think your words are enough to change that? Barron shook his head. Not my words, but the truth. And the truth is, America didn't become great because people sat back and accepted defeat. It became great because people fought for what was right, even when the odds were against them. John let out a bitter laugh. And yet, here we are. A country where being proud of America makes you the enemy. Where standing for the anthem gets you booed. Where people who never sacrificed a damn thing get to tell us what patriotism means. Barron's expression didn't waver. So what do we do about it? John was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed. You're young. You still think you can win, Barron nodded. And you're old enough to know what happens if we stop trying. John studied him carefully, his expression unreadable. The moderator finally broke the silence. John, earlier you said America isn't the same country you fought for. Do you believe it can be again? John didn't answer right away. For the first time, he actually looked uncertain. Then finally he spoke. Only if enough people remember what it's supposed to be. Barron leaned back slightly, his voice steady. Then let's make them remember. The studio was silent. Nobody had expected the debate to end this way. John exhaled sharply. You talk like someone who hasn't seen what this country is really capable of. Barron's gaze didn't waver. I've seen what happens when people give up on it. John scoffed. And what? You think some big speech is going to change that? You think standing here, telling people to remember America, is enough to fix this mess? Barron shook his head. No, but forgetting is what got us here in the first place. John leaned back, rubbing his hands together, his expression unreadable. You think people forgot? He shook his head. They didn't forget. They were told to forget. They were told that loving their country made them the bad guy. That standing for the flag was offensive. That fighting for freedom was outdated. Barron's fingers tapped lightly on the table. Then the real fight isn't just about remembering. It's about refusing to let them rewrite the past. John let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. You don't get it. They don't have to rewrite the past. They just have to control the future. Barron tilted his head. And yet, here we are, talking about it, exposing it, fighting back. John studied him for a long moment. So what, you think you're going to start a revolution? Barron's lips pressed together for a second before he responded. No, but I think we can stop one. The moderator shifted in his seat, sensing the debate had reached something more than just a discussion. It had become a question of what came next. John, earlier in this debate, you said America wasn't the same country you fought for. Now let me ask you something else. Do you still believe in it? John didn't answer right away. He ran a hand over his face, his fingers resting against his chin. He looked at Barron. He looked at the audience. Then finally he spoke. That depends. Barron raised an eyebrow. On what? John exhaled. On whether or not people like you actually mean what you say. The room held its breath. The challenge had been laid down. Now it was Barron's turn to answer. Barron Trump didn't flinch at John's words. He met the veteran's gaze with unwavering resolve, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. I mean every word. John let out a slow breath, leaning forward. His eyes were sharp, searching, testing. Then prove it. The audience was silent, the weight of the challenge hanging heavy in the air. The debate wasn't about policies anymore. It wasn't about sound bites or arguments. It was about whether Barron truly believed in everything he had said, or if this was just another moment that would fade like all the others. Barron took his time before answering. The proof isn't in what I say. It's in what happens next. John narrowed his eyes. And what happens next? Barron leaned back, his voice steady. People stop being afraid to stand up. They stop letting themselves be silenced. They stop letting the loudest voices in the room be the ones that hate this country. John shook his head, letting out a bitter laugh. You think it's that simple? Barron nodded. I think that's where it starts. The audience was still, as if afraid to break the moment. The moderator, watching closely, finally spoke. John, you've spent years saying America is on the decline, that the fight has already been lost. Do you still believe that? John exhaled, rubbing his hands together. He looked around the room, then back at Barron. Finally, he sighed. I don't know. The words weren't defiant. They weren't defensive. They were honest. Barron studied him for a moment before nodding. Then maybe it's time to find out. The studio remained silent, waiting for what would happen next. For once, John had nothing left to say. John Reynolds sat back in his chair, rubbing his hands together, his gaze locked onto the table in front of him. The weight of the conversation, of everything that had been said, pressed against him. He wasn't a man who backed down from a fight, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he was still fighting the right battle. He looked up at Barron, the young man who had held his ground, who had refused to let him sink into the easy comfort of cynicism. You're young, John finally said, his voice quieter than before. You still believe people can change. Barron nodded. I believe people can remember who they are. John let out a slow breath, glancing toward the audience, toward the cameras. And if they don't? Barron's expression didn't change. Then the people who want to tear this country apart win. John exhaled, shaking his head. You make it sound like it's that simple. Barron leaned forward slightly, his voice unwavering. It is. John studied him, his fingers tightening slightly against the armrest of his chair. And what happens if we lose? Barron didn't blink. Then we keep fighting. The moderator cleared his throat, glancing between them. Gentlemen, I think we've reached the heart of this debate. One final question for both of you. What does America's future look like? John let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he looked at Barron. That depends on whether or not you're right. Barron's response was immediate. It depends on whether or not people like you still believe it's worth fighting for. The silence in the studio was heavy. The audience wasn't shifting anymore. They weren't waiting for a winner. They were waiting for an answer. The studio was silent. Not the kind of silence that came from hesitation, but the kind that came from realization. From weight, from the feeling that something had shifted. John Reynolds sat still, his fingers laced together, his jaw tight. He had spent his life fighting first for his country, then against the very system that had left him and so many like him behind. And now, for the first time, he found himself at a crossroads. Across from him, Barron Trump didn't look away. He didn't gloat. He didn't press his advantage. He simply waited. John exhaled sharply, looking toward the audience. Some of them had been with him from the beginning. Some had nodded at his frustration, had cheered when he spoke about betrayal, about loss, about the slow decay of the country he had once believed in. But now they were waiting for something else. Something final. John turned back to Barron, his voice steady but lower than before. You really believe it, don't you? Barron's answer came without hesitation. Yes, John scoffed, shaking his head. Even with everything stacked against you? Even when they call you every name in the book? Even when they try to erase everything people like me fought for? Barron leaned forward, his eyes locked onto John's. Especially then. John studied him, searching for cracks in his confidence, for hesitation, for doubt. He found none. The moderator, sensing the weight of the moment, spoke carefully. John, you've spent this debate telling us what's wrong with this country. But now I have one final question. Do you still believe in America? John let out a slow breath. He didn't answer right away. He let the question settle, let it weigh down on him. Then, finally, he straightened his back. I believe in the people who still have the guts to fight for it. Barron nodded once. John let out a small, almost imperceptible smirk. Don't screw it up, kid. The studio lights flickered slightly as the debate came to its natural close. The audience, sensing the moment's gravity, didn't erupt into cheers. Instead, they clapped slow, steady, measured. Because for the first time in a long time, it wasn't just another argument. It was a choice. And America was watching. America is at a turning point. The real question is, will people stand up for the truth, or will they let others rewrite history? If you believe in standing for what is right, let your voice be heard. Tell us in the comments, do you think Barron Trump is right? Or is John Reynolds speaking the hard truth? Make sure to subscribe so you never miss a story that challenges the narrative. And if this debate made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because in the end, the future belongs to those who refuse to stay silent.